3 ships and left from Spain. He sailed through sunshine, wind, and rain. He sailed by night. He sailed by day. He used the stars to find his way. A compass also helped him know how to find the way to go. 90 sailors were on board. Some worked while others snored. Then the workers went to sleep and others watched the ocean deep. Day after day, they looked for land. They dreamed of trees and rocks and sand. October 12th, their dream came true. You never saw a happier crew. Indians, Indians, Columbus cried. His heart was filled with joyful pride. But India, the land was not. It was the Bahamas, and it was hot. The Arakawa natives were very nice. They gave the sailors food and spice. Columbus sailed on to find some gold to bring back home, as he'd been told. He made the trip again and again, trading gold to bring to Spain. The first American? No, not quite. But Columbus was brave and he was bright. This rhyme from a 1991 picture book written by Jean Marzolo is more or less what I learned about Columbus when I was a kid. Like most American school kids, I was taught a tale of discovery, of human bravery, of perseverance and triumph over adversity, a story of how a small world got much bigger. As stories go, it's a pretty compelling one. Here in 2020, 528 years after that voyage, we know a bit more. We know that this story is not the whole story. In fact, it's kind of hard to imagine what I'd need to do to myself to accept it as a true story. There's no mention of the colonists left behind or of what those colonists did to the local inhabitants they met. No mention of the enslavement and forced removal of 1,500 people from the Caribbean islands. No mention of disease, no mention of how Columbus ordered his overseers to chop the hands off of inadequately productive indigenous slaves. We can argue about how much truth a school-aged kid needs to have, what's appropriate to share, but I'm reminded of a recent story of one Chicagoan, 8-year-old King Johnson. Johnson, who kept a journal as part of his classwork, one day wrote this entry. Today was not a good learning day. You said something wrong and I can't listen when I hear lies. Columbus didn't find our country, the Indians did. I like to have Columbus Day off, but I want you to not teach me lies. That is all. And with that, King Johnson had spoken. That is all. So last week we talked a little bit about the relationship between the truth and the stories that science tells about our world. And for those of you that missed it, tisk tisk, but the linkage between those two is maybe best described as, quote, it's complicated. Today I want to suggest that the relationship between the truth and the stories we tell ourselves about the world is maybe a bit more straightforward. Maybe. Now is a good time to pay respects to my colleague, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III of Trinity Church in downtown Chicago. And as we do, somewhere on the screen, I'm going to ask you to pick out that little square that's filled with one of the faces from your community. It doesn't really matter which one. And now repeat after me. Neighbor, oh neighbor, there is no freedom without truth. Thank you. Amen. In 1992, Lonnie Hancock, the mayor of Berkeley, California, followed the example set by the state of South Dakota when she issued a proclamation changing the designation for the October 12th holiday. Mayor Hancock said, quote, Berkeley wants to celebrate the important place that indigenous people hold in this country. Their societies and philosophies flourished long before Columbus arrived, and they continue until today. Since then, 13 more states, plus the District of Columbia, have followed suit and now officially recognize Indigenous Peoples Day. For many of us, this recognition is an obvious and good thing, about time, long overdue. A 2015 study called, quote, it's called Manifesting Destiny, Representations of Indigenous Peoples in K through 12 U.S. History Standards. It's the name of the study. It says, quote, the narrative presented in U.S. history standards when analyzed with a critical eye directed students to see Indigenous peoples as a long since forgotten history of this country's development. They also reported that history lessons as a whole, quote, tell a traditional Euro-American narrative of immigration in the United States that largely ignores historical and current acts of xenophobia and discrimination across the country. All in all, it's difficult to paint a picture of what life is for the average person of native descent, but the challenges that face them today are at least grim. Today, there are about 4.5 million people of Native American or Alaskan Native descent living in the United States, less than 1.5% of the total population here. Across all demographics in the United States, our Indigenous peoples see the highest rates of poverty. Unemployment is typically twice the national average. Education rates are lower. Access to healthcare and adequate housing also lower. Incarceration rates are 38% higher. Disenfranchisement is also higher. Type 2 diabetes, addiction, and suicide rates all higher. Life expectancy is 5 years lower than the average for Americans. For the person who cares about equity, these statistics are daunting. The truth is, the stories of Native Americans, of what happened to them and what is still happening to them, are intrinsically a part of the American cultural story. Now, the contributions of Native peoples to the lifestyle and the rest of Americans currently enjoy is pretty long. Now, I want to pause just for a moment and mention a few in case you were confused. Corn, rubber, kayaks, snow goggles, cables, suspension bridges, raised bed gardening, baby bottles, syringes, hammocks, tobacco, cotton, quinine, tomatoes, potatoes, sweet potatoes, avocado, chewing gum, hockey, lacrosse, camouflage, sunscreen, hemp, chocolate. Did I say chocolate? Chocolate and corn. I mentioned corn, right? Corn. This is important for this area, corn. We now know that Native peoples were using painkillers and oral contraception thousands of years before the colonists arrived. And we think it was the Native Americans that taught European sailors the trick of avoiding scurvy on long voyages. One innovation common to Native cultures that did not, sadly, catch on was the idea of regular personal hygiene. Europeans needed a few hundred years of exposure before we got, quote, cleanliness is next to godliness. In a past sermon, I've talked about the book, The Truth About Stories. Written by Native American writer and activist Thomas King, the book explores how stories shape who we are and how we interact with other people. At the beginning of each essay, King wrote that, quote, the truth about stories is that's all we are. His point, perhaps, is that stories not only shape our reality, in many ways, they are our reality. Likewise, when stories are absent, when voices have not been heard, those untold stories limit us, even as they harm those who have been silenced. The point is to tell the stories, to give them space, and then we can choose what to do with it. As King tells us, quote, that story is yours now. Do with it what you will. Cry over it, get angry, forget it, but don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard this story. You've heard it now. My kids have a story about Columbus. Unlike my own school lessons, theirs were a tad more interesting, especially since they included discussions about the short and long-term impact on the local societies that Columbus encountered, as well as a discussion of the actions he took to find and extract valuables to take back to Europe. Like young King Johnson, my kids were distinctly unimpressed with the grand claims of discovery. And instead, their class chose to not only indict Captain Columbus for crimes against humanity, but then held a mock trial. That day is part of their story. An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is a 2015 American Book Award winner and the 2019 Common Read for the Unitarian Universalist Association. Every year, the UUA picks an important book that UUs all over the world might want to read, another story to complement or to challenge a more dominant story, one that our society has been telling, one that is likely damaging to a real, living, and hurting part of our interdependent web. This history is a retelling of American history through the decidedly less than romantic eyes of a Native American. I'm not going to summarize the book for you. You need to go pick one up. But I do want to mention that this book is part of a larger project, a revisioning American history project from Beacon Press, our own UU publishing house. And they do this, by the way, to, quote, offer fresh perspectives on familiar narratives, and is told from the viewpoint of underrepresented communities. Consisting of excessively written history books by notable scholars, the series reconstructs and reinterprets American history from diverse perspectives, including African American, indigenous peoples, workers, people of Latin descent, the queer community, and others. Gayatri Patnaik, the editor at Beacon Press overseeing the series, says, quote, that each title will fundamentally challenge and also change how you think about American history. Beacon Press revisioning isn't the only such project going on right now. Last year, the New York Times launched the 1619 Project. The goal there was to, quote, reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. What they did was create and publish a remarkable series of essays that explore many aspects of our unique and tragic history, aspects that are not popular, not uplifting, not triumphant, stories that show a stark counterpoint to any attempt to tell the American story as one of exceptionalism. These stories make a lot of people very uncomfortable. People like the President of the United States, who only 3 weeks ago attacked the 1619 Project, saying, quote, the left has warped, distorted, and defiled the American story with deceptions, falsehoods, and lies. There is no better example than the New York Times' totally discredited 1619 Project. This project rewrites American history to teach our children that we were founded on the principle of oppression, not freedom. This week, my wife and I sat down with the kids and we watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix. If you have not done so, consider this more homework. Go find a way to fit this into your schedule. The point of the documentary is to show another side to social media. Among other things, social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and a host of others all promise engagement, human connection, a more fulfilling and more interesting life, and arguably, social media does that, but that's not all it does. Social media also increases isolation, reinforces stereotypes, and is perhaps the most efficient platform for the spread of disinformation since Fox News. Political polarization and suicide rates among teens are correlated directly and exactly with the launch of Facebook. One of my favorite facts from the Netflix show is that because of social media, lies spread 7 times faster than truth. Watching this documentary, listening to the president talk about the 1619 project, heck, just reading the news, it strikes me that we are in the middle of an epidemic, one that's not only swamping our stories, but threatening to kill off even the idea of truth. I'm reminded of the wall in the back of my 9th grade social studies classroom where Mr. Wilson had taped up the words in 12-inch tall letters cut out of construction paper. Those who do not learn it are destined to repeat it. We all joked that he was talking about us failing his class, but honestly, I really don't find this scene all that funny today. It troubles me. Because the truth about stories is that's all we are. And when we fail to tell them, when we fail to hear them, when we actively squelch them, hide them, erase them, tell only the half that makes us look good, then what are we? What would our ancestors say? Have we not broken faith? Have we not broken a sacred trust? Are we really going to just repeat the lessons over and over, world without end? What will it take until we finally listen? Tomorrow is Columbus Day, and I wonder if any of you know why that is. I'll be honest, I did not. In preparing this sermon and with the requirement to tell our stories and to listen when they're told, I went looking. Some of you may know that President Nixon gave us the day off in 1972. Some of you may know that it was President Roosevelt, however, that made Columbus Day a holiday back in 1934. But why celebrate Columbus here in the nation he never actually set foot in? The answer, like most good stories, is complicated. In 1892, 11 Italian Americans were lynched by a mob in New Orleans. Over 50 separate lynchings of Italians have been documented from 1890 to 1920. It was Italians and Catholics living in San Francisco who responded by celebrating Columbus, creating this Columbus Day celebration, quote, as a way to mainstream and humanize themselves in the face of rampant American discrimination. That is, Columbus was chosen and lifted up specifically as an Italian that Americans could identify with and celebrate, someone worthy of more than scorn, in the hope that one day Italian Americans might be less mocked, less ridiculed, and less hated in the country they had chosen to make their home. That story may sound familiar to you, and it should. Thinking about that echo, it is tempting to me to do my own revisioning of American history, to tell the truth that our stories include a long chain of appalling behavior. Maybe it's not so hard to understand. Our nation was founded by a bunch of abuse victims fleeing religious oppression in England. Maybe it's not weird that their descendants reflected that abuse on literally everyone that followed them. We oppressed the natives, we oppressed the Africans, we oppressed the Irish, the Chinese, the Italians, the Germans, the Japanese, anyone LGBTQI, Muslim or of Latin descent. It's not hard to see our American story as a long chain of oppression stories. I want to pause a moment, though, and lift up that none of these stories are equivalent. None of these stories carry the same weight. There are no winners in the Olympics of dehumanization. But just as the truth about American history includes stories of American progress, the rule of democracy, and astonishing accomplishment, it also includes stories of all those we have treated with astonishing disregard and disdain. We are all of those stories. So here we are on Columbus Day. On the one hand, Columbus was not a hero and does not deserve a place in the pantheon of the good. Celebrating him and his exploits causes harm to Native Americans and erases their stories, their history, and their ongoing struggles. The temptation is to pretend that Columbus Day isn't happening, to simply erase Columbus Day from the holiday record and instead use the opportunity to center the voices, the traditions, and the stories of those he has victimized, to name the sovereignty that he violated, to lament the ongoing pain and suffering of the descendants of those he wronged, those that still cry out today for justice. It is quite popular among my colleagues to do this, and I completely understand the temptation. And yet, on the other hand, I also now know that Columbus Day wasn't just about Columbus, but instead it was also about one oppressed group's desperate attempt and awful struggle to be recognized as worthy of dignity and respect by a society that was actively engaged in harming them. Honestly, I don't know what to do with Columbus Day. Maybe that's the point in all this. Stories are complicated because people are complicated, because life is complicated, and that is the truth. But I do know this: some stories are too terrible to be forgotten. And despite the president's claims about hating America, these stories are our stories. They are American stories. Unless we tell them, unless we own them, unless they become part of our own story, we will never be the America we could be. And unless we embrace that, until we embrace it, we are lost, because there is no freedom without truth. For now, I'll give the final word to young King Johnson, who told us that, quote, "It's important to tell the truth because the world should be full of trust and love." May we be filled with trust and love. May our stories be told. And may we be all brave enough to listen. Amen.